Good to kick off?
Good to go. Yep.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. Hello, my name is Lori Durante. I'm a director at FS Investments, focused on relationship management on our national accounts team, and I'm co-chair of the FS Women's Network. I'm also a member of the WIN Events Committee. And on behalf of the Women in Investing Network of Philadelphia, FS Investments, and our Events Committee, I welcome you to tonight's panel. We hope that you enjoy this panel as much as we did putting this together. Today, as we partner with FS Investments to bring you this topic on the impact that COVID has had on our economy, our investments, and our communities, we thank the panelists in advance for their thoughtful perspectives on the COVID era that we're all managing in. The idea generation for tonight's panel event came from a collaboration with my colleagues on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee and the Women's Network. We'd like to sincerely thank the panelists who have joined us tonight and will provide their insights on this unprecedented environment, shedding some light on areas that impact us all. Before we move to the next slide, I'd be remiss if I didn't give my firm a quick shout out. FS Investments, we've been a WIN sponsor since 2017, and we've hosted a number of terrific events. As a firm, we are continually focused on building a more diverse and inclusive organization. That effort is both internally focused, such as engagement on our employees with our various employee resources groups, such as FS Women's Network, and externally focused, such as our partnership with professional organizations like Women in Investing Network. As a WIN events team member, I am proud of our firm's support of WIN and our virtual hosting of tonight's important discussion on the impact of COVID in the economy, our households, and our communities. For those that have attended our events in the past, we are missing our reception venue out in the Navy Yard in Philadelphia with our talented chefs and events team. And we're hopeful that we can pick that up again next year and hopefully see everyone in person, fingers crossed. Before we get started with tonight's panel, I'd like to quickly share some highlights on WIN for those that might be new to the event, for any of our events, or that are just able to attend because this is a virtual event and you're not based locally. Since 2007, WIN has been promoting education and cross-industry networking in our region. Our members truly have a diverse background, from portfolio managers to operations managers, students and recruiters, attorneys, and plan sponsors. What we all can agree on is that we share an appreciation for both learning something new and the value of networking. Cross-industry events like this one are relatively rare and a great opportunity to meet peers outside of your firm, which is one of the key reasons that I joined WIN 2 years ago when moving from New York City to Philadelphia. We're pleased to have had over 800 professionals attend in a wide range of topics this past year. Our industry reach is over 2,000 professionals for each of our monthly meetings, representing over 200 active and growing WIN members. We invite you to join us into the new year of programming, as now more than ever, engaging with your industry colleagues is important to your business and your career. So housekeeping, a few quick housekeeping items before I move to the agenda. Please make sure that your name on your video reflects how you'd like to be addressed later in the Q&A or networking session. All attendees will be muted during the presentation to keep background noise at a reasonable level. We just heard some dogs barking earlier, some husbands that are coming in, so you'll all be muted for now. We strongly encourage questions and would love to hear from the audience thereafter, so please use the chat function and we'll address as many as we can after the panel, but before our networking breakout. So quickly moving into our agenda, we have a great event planned for this afternoon. The program will go until about 5:30. At the end of the program, we will first address questions from attendees, then we will break into random networking groups. Colleen, our much appreciated WIN administrator and the woman behind the scenes, will put us into Zoom breakout groups. And this networking break will last about 12 to 15 minutes. And the time will go by pretty quickly for those that have joined in the past. They do really fly by. So no real rules in the breakout rooms, but please feel free to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about the program, meet some new friends, create a contact, and feel free to follow up after. So our upcoming events, this past fall, we hosted a few events on gender lens investing, elections and government, and a TED Talk on courageous career journeys. We just kicked off a series for young professionals and college students with a career carousel to help educate them on different career paths. December 10th will be our wrap up for 2020 year with WIN, the virtual holiday event. Chocolate and wine will be our focus, and an appeal to contribute to a local community through Philadelphia COVID-19 Fund. On behalf of WIN, we hope that you can all join us in 2021, where we will be focusing next year on topics such as women on boards, design thinking, and team engagement and leadership for an evolving work world. WIN members really benefit from the generous support of our sponsors like FS Investments. Our 21 corporate sponsors supply ideas and speakers, and in non-COVID times, places to meet with some refreshments. So thank you wholeheartedly to the folks that are on this list. I know a lot of you are on the call today. So just quickly talking about who is FS before we dive into our event. Our firm, previously known as Franklin Square, was rebranded to FS Investments and founded in 2007 by Michael Foreman and headquartered here in Philadelphia in the Navy Yard. Our main objective is to provide individual and retail clients with access to institutional strategies and managers focusing on alternative sources of income, growth, and absolute return. With our recent acquisition of Chiron Investment Management, we currently have about 21 billion in AUM across a variety of alternative investment strategies, including private and alternative credit, real estate, energy, multi-strategy, long-short equity, and the list goes on. They are across a variety of structures as well. So spanning the liquidity spectrum, we offer BDCs, a NAV REIT, interval funds, our first private placement, mutual funds, and some other liquid alts. And lastly, you can learn a little bit more about us at fsinvestments.com, or feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Natalie Marvi-Romeo. Natalie, thank you so much for hosting tonight's event. I'll leave it to you to introduce the panelists.
Great. Thanks, Lori. I'm so excited to be here. We've got a great panel for you tonight. And with that, I'm going to just turn it right straight to them. I can see Markita first on my screen in the tile. So I'd ask Markita to introduce herself and then turn it over to Rachel and Lara.
Happy to. Thank you, Natalie. I'm Markita Morris-Louis. I'm Chief Strategy Officer for Compass Working Capital. Compass is a national nonprofit that is focused on helping families, particularly families in federally subsidized housing, build assets as a pathway out of poverty and towards financial stability. We primarily work with women, mothers, and families who are living in federally subsidized housing. And we believe that housing could be a platform for social mobility, particularly if our nation's anti-poverty work is focused on asset building. You know, many of you all know very well that assets are a way to not only invest in your future and your children's future, but also to weather unpredictable financial circumstances like a global health crisis. So we believe that families with low incomes should absolutely have access to asset building opportunities, and that we need to create policies that give them the opportunity to do so. And I'm very excited to be here with you all tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Markita. Rachel, would you like to go next?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Moran. I'm a senior financial planner and shareholder at RTD Financial. RTD is a fee-only registered investment advisor based in Philadelphia. Nowhere near as big as FS, but we do manage 1.7 billion in assets, and we work with about 500 families across 5 different offices. I've been with RTD for 7 years, and right now I'm working with 65 clients. And I work with many different types of clients, but I particularly enjoy working with single women, whether it's divorced, widowed, or just never married. And I found a niche working with healthcare and pharmaceutical executives, really helping them dig through their executive comp packages, structuring deferred compensation and long-term incentive plans. Personally, I live in Fairmount with my husband, and my daughter Audrey just turned 8 months today, which if you do the math, that means she was born one day after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. So I've also been managing becoming a new mom amidst all this craziness. But I'm really excited to be here with you all today and share some thoughts with you. So thank you for having me.
Great. Well, we are looking forward to hearing from you, Rachel and Markita, and welcome back, Lara. You've been a frequent speaker to WIN, and we're excited to have you again today, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Lara Rhame. I'm the chief economist at FS Investments, and I've worked at FS for 5 years now. And I have been in Philadelphia now for 13 years after spending most of my career up in New York City. I have just feel like now when I talk to all of my financial market colleagues in New York, I just can't stop talking about how much I love Philadelphia, and that certainly has not changed during the pandemic. So looking forward to hearing some of the insights that Markita has about our city as we move forward into the panel discussion today. And Rachel, it's a good reminder to all of us that as crazy as we feel like our lives are, they can always be crazier. So I live in Center City with my daughters who are 10 and 11, and they're schooling at home. So we've all had to really, I think, find new resilience within ourselves as we face a year of so much uncertainty. So my job is to talk about both the economy and what I call macro financial markets. So broad S&P 500, interest rates. I began my career at the Federal Reserve Bank and have worked at several of the largest investment banks on Wall Street. And so what for me, I think is such a treat at FS Investments is to distill information about the economy, which can shockingly is sometimes viewed as a dry subject, into a way that can be easily understood and bring the passion that I have for studying the economy to things that people can really take away in their day-to-day lives. The economy is something that everybody is thinking about and touches and is concerned about. And yet at the same time, it's sometimes hard to understand exactly what the direction of the economy means for our day-to-day lives and connecting that to financial markets. So I look forward to participating in the panel discussion today.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Well, so COVID has impacted so much of our lives, our conversation, and our world. I know we've talked about it a lot at WIN at our Saturday morning coffee chats. We were all trying to support each other through the challenges that we faced at work and at home. And I'm so excited to hear what our panelists have to say. And as Laura said, kind of the interconnectivity of the markets, the economy, what Markita has to share with us about the community, and Rachel has to share with us about individuals. We have a couple polls just to kick us off right before we get to the panel. So I'm going to ask Colleen to launch those so we can just see where everybody's perspective is. Great. So our first one is just to get a sense of how, COVID has impacted our people that are attending today. Go ahead and submit yours, and it'll be anonymous, but we'll get the results coming up just as soon as everybody's clicked through. I feel like I'm on Jeopardy waiting for the answer.
Just a few more respondents I'm waiting for.
Okay, great.
All right, here's the, okay, and I can share the results on that one. Can you see it?
Great. Wow, we can. So job loss 15%, family member got sick 31%. Almost none of our audience has gotten sick, which is great to hear. And 56% no effect on the family.
Okay.
All right, let's
Let me
look
get
at
the
them.
next
Let's
one.
go on to the next one, Colleen.
Yep. Here we go.
So we've had an incredibly robust growth in Q3. Share with us, are you still worried about the economy?
go.
Wow. So thankfully, low percentages on the impact on a personal level, but a resounding worried group about the economy. And I'll confess I'm in that one. I'm in the yes, in the 91%. So, wow, Laura, I guess it's time to have you give us some reality of where we are with the economy. Can you start us off with an overview?
I thought to facilitate our conversation today, just a few graphs and a little bit of context for the economy might be useful. So, Lori, let's flip to the next slide, which shows gross domestic product, right? Real GDP. This is the broadest measure that we have that looks at growth in our economy. And I think, never in my wildest imaginings did I think that we would get quarterly swings of this magnitude. Normally, when I'm looking at a GDP forecast, I'm really agonizing over whether we're going to have 2% growth or 2.5% growth, right? Those two forecasts are really different. What we saw in the second quarter was a 31.4% quarterly decline. That's the biggest disruption that we have on record. We know that we probably had a bigger record during the Great Depression. We just didn't have quarterly GDP data back then, but that's how far back you have to go. And that was followed in the third quarter by a 33% increase. Now, that doesn't mean that growth is all the way back to where it was. We're still about 5% below where we were pre-COVID, and we're still probably looking at a 2020 growth contraction, right? So the entire economy probably shrank in 2020 by about 4%. And I've given you a projection here. This is not my forecast. This is the forecast of the consensus Philadelphia survey of professional forecasters, which shows growth now moderating from here to about 4%. But I think many of us are seeing the surge in the cases. We're seeing the winter coming. The fact that we got such robust growth in the third quarter almost just subtracts some of the potential growth that we could see going forward. And I think the chances of a small contraction or a double dip in the first quarter is growing. I'll say this, it's not unusual during a recession to have sort of a sawtooth pattern. But then again, nothing about this experience, I think, has been usual. So it's very hard to find any kind of sort of historic comparison. So I just want to talk a little bit, and Lori, let's move to the next slide, because if you've heard me speak before, you've probably seen this visual. And it's one of my favorites because one of the most, I think, misunderstood pieces of the economy is that it is really actually very different from financial markets. And there's probably been no better example than the current sort of what we've experienced in 2020 to drive that home. The economy is really grounded in the dollars and cents that are spent, produced, built by all of the activity that we have in our households and that we see in businesses, that we sort of the household stimulus checks we get from the government. Those are all the hard dollars and cents that we add up every quarter to get GDP, or the measure of the economy. But financial markets, while they're certainly linked to the economy, are subject to a wide variety of factors that mean that they behave very differently and often whipsaw much more than the underlying economy. Things like quantitative easing or Fed rate cuts, right? Monetary policy is involved there. Financial markets react to the fact that while the economy is weak right now, right, financial markets are more forward looking. So one of the reasons why, while the economy has not given us a V-shaped recovery, financial markets, fell into a bear market over 5 weeks, and then over 5 months completely recovered and have kept right on going. a lot of that is because they're looking ahead to 2021, 2025, to when we have a vaccine that is widely distributed if things are kind of back to where they were. So we're seeing a wide variety of factors that have impacted financial markets very differently than the economy. And I know Rachel will really be able to expand upon that when she talks about the discussions she had with people while we were seeing, financial markets experiencing such a severe disruption in the beginning of the year. And Lori, let's move to the next slide, because I just wanted to make a couple final points about how the economy is looking right now. I think there's no more acute experience of an economic downturn than job losses. And the fact that 15% of the folks on this call today said they'd experienced a job loss really aligns with what we've seen. Because again, the economy has not made a V-shaped recovery, and employment has not made a V-shaped recovery. We still see about 10 million people that are still unemployed that were not previously unemployed going into this pandemic. That is an enormous dislocation in labor. And I think something that is also cause for concern is the fact that the nature of job losses is changing. While temporary layoffs are sort of swinging back and we see those folks coming back, we're starting to see a rise in permanent job losses, which are up now 2.5 million from February until October. So that is really a concerning trend. And the final graph, Lori, to end on, or second to last graph to end on, shows part of the reason that we're experiencing this shift from temporary to permanent is because we're starting to see businesses also close permanently. So back in April, only 20% of business closures were considered to be permanent. Now that's up to 60%. And of course, it's not a surprise where a lot of this is coming from. Restaurants, bricks and mortar shopping, all of these things I think are particularly vulnerable as we look to the winter and we see COVID cases rising again. So I would summarize this by saying that while our recession and this downturn started in such an exceptional and unique way, it's kind of turning into something that is looking a little bit more like a normal recession, where lingering job losses could keep us in a more cautious environment where households are a little bit more uncertain. And I think, again, that was also reflected in our survey. All of us, whether we lost our jobs or not, only 15% lost our jobs, but 90% of us are worried about the economy. That all sort of becomes, all of that uncertainty really permeates a lot of our decisions. And then finally, I just wanted to bring this back to Philadelphia. So that last graph shows where the US unemployment rate has improved. It is down now to 6.9%. The Philadelphia region is pretty much tracking along that national number, but in Philadelphia, we are lagging, and we have been lagging all along. We are, a large city with a vibrant restaurant life, a vibrant tourism sector, a lot of hotels, things like the convention center. All of that being shut down has impacted our local economy. And we've seen the Philadelphia unemployment rate at 10.8% when last month the national unemployment rate was about 7.5%. This data is released with a 1 month lag, but it shows you that our city and many metro cities are experiencing COVID in a very different way than the national average. So I'll leave that there because I'm eager to hear where we take this in the conversation, Natalie, and kick it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Laura. That was awesome. You always make it so clear and understandable for all of us. And thank you for bringing it to the local level. I mean, I'm sorry about the statistics, but I'm grateful to know where we stand. And I think that's really helpful. And thinking back to your slide with the kite, would think about the time when the kite crashed back in Q1 and turn it over to Rachel and say, how did your clients react? I can imagine you might have had some clients that wanted to pull their money out of the market. And how did you advise them?
Yeah. Fortunately, gosh, since March, we've had countless conversations with our clients. We've really tried to make ourselves available for them. We've hosted town halls, but fortunately, only a handful actually requested we pull money out of the market. And I think planners is really trying to alleviate the stress and worry around money. Are in retirement or within 5 years of retirement. And within that liquidity account, we hold 5 years of their living expenses in cash, CDs, and ladder bonds. And the reason being is that the average recovery from a 40+% decline has been about 58 months. So that really reiterates that we have time, right? We can wait this out. We're not going to have to sell from the market at an unopportune time. We have your living expenses set aside in a separate portfolio. I think that goes a long way and just making them feel a little bit more comforted. But sometimes that only goes so far, right? It's still a very stressful period of time, and seeing your portfolio drop 30% is a lot different than talking about it in terms of risk tolerance. So, as our clients were coming to us concerned, I think the biggest thing we want to do is really meet them with empathy, recognize their concern, hear them out, sympathize with them. But again, trying to remind them that timing the market is really almost an impossible task because you have to time it twice. You have to decide when to get out and when to get back in. And, you heard Lara say the whipsaw effect of the markets, and it's so true, right? The speed of a recovery often mirrors, the speed of the decline. So if we're waiting to jump back in until we see favorable economic trends, it could be a while, and we're probably going to miss that recovery. There's a famous quote by Peter Lynch that we like to tell our clients, and it's far more money has been lost by investors preparing for corrections or trying to anticipate corrections than in the corrections themselves. So while it doesn't feel good, oftentimes the advice is, stay the course. Inaction doesn't always feel great, but it's often the best decision. We want to focus on the things that we can control. Again, that being said, there still might be clients who want to pull money out of the market, and we did have a few. And I think first we want to say, is there an amount of cash that would make you feel comfortable? As opposed to selling everything, is there some amount of cash that would feel comfortable? And we did have a client who said, yes, I want $100,000 off the table. We don't have to sell everything, but I just want $100,000 in cash. That would help me sleep better. Fine, we do that. If that's still not the case, then we'll try and maybe just sell equities as opposed to selling everything. And if that's the case, we always want to first look at the impact of their financial plan. We have to assume that if they pull the money out, that they're not going to be able to participate in that recovery because we're not going to time it right. So we'll look at the impact on their long-term financial projections and start to talk about trade-offs. And that might make them start to think further about, is this really the right decision for me? Do I want to make these trade-offs? And sometimes the answer is still yes. And if we're going further down that path, I think the next question is, what's our strategy for getting back in? We never want to take money out of the market without having a strategy for re-entering the market. So for the few clients that did take money out, we always had a strategy to re-enter the market. We're going to invest 25% at a time at these defined intervals. This is the plan. We're going to stick to it. It's going to be on autopilot. That's how we're going to re-enter the market. So So fortunately, I think, through the education and the focus on liquidity accounts, we've really been able to ensure that our clients are remaining invested and can participate in that recovery. But it is really difficult to discuss the concept of risk tolerance and the mix of assets in your portfolio, and then to actually experience those losses that we talk about. So navigating those conversations is definitely difficult for sure.
I can imagine though the education that you did up front, at least you can say, remember we talked about this, remember
Right.
we had the liquidity plan. I mean, I'd have to think that that translates to the success you've had in keeping your clients invested in the market.
Yeah, I think so.
That's great. So shifting a little bit from the individual to the community, Markita, I'd like to direct it to you. Research has shown that low-income communities have been more impacted from COVID, if it's from, exposure to the virus or higher mortality rates or loss of jobs. And just thinking back to some of those statistics that Laura shared with us about Philadelphia, I wonder if you could share with us how your communities have been impacted.
Yep, absolutely. And I just want to frame this a little bit and give a little more context about our work. So at Compass Working Capital, we partner with public housing authorities and also nonprofit and for-profit developers of affordable housing to run an asset building model program called Family Self-Sufficiency. And it's actually promulgated through HUD. And it was enacted 30 years ago, really to help families and public housing increase their income and to move out of public housing and all public benefits into self-sufficiency. We've made more of an asset building frame on this program, which was initially set up as a workforce development frame. And as families living in public housing, typically they pay about 30% of their income as a way to keep the housing affordable. But as their income increases, so too does their rent. So yes, on the one hand, it is an affordability mechanism, but on the other hand, it has the unintended consequence of making it difficult for families to move on and off of poverty, because as they're increasing their income and paying more rent, they're also no longer able to receive and no longer eligible for other benefits that are means tested, that are based on income. So you might get a modest raise that raises your rent, but then you also lose a childcare subsidy. And families often tell us that they take one step forward, they feel like they're taking two steps back. This program that we operate, Family Self-Sufficiency, as families raise their income and their rent increases, they can bank the difference into an escrow account that they can accrue over multiple years. And we provide free financial coaching to them, helping families set goals, build their credit, save outside of the escrow account that's tied to rent. Also, they can do things like purchase homes, pay for tuition for themselves or their children, and just dream and have the freedom and the flexibility and the opportunity to build wealth, oftentimes for the first times in their lives. So just wanted to set the groundwork for that. And we work with about 2,000 families right now in New England and also in Philadelphia, and we have a close partnership with the Philadelphia Housing Authority. We did a survey back in April of our Philadelphia clients, and about 62% are experiencing a loss or reduction of income. Another 18% told us that they're experiencing an increase in medical expenses. About 3/4 were also seeing an overall increases in their kind of personal monthly expenses between purchasing PPE. Now children are at home, 5 days a week, so more food and increasing utilities. And out of those also surveyed, we saw that about nearly 50% had a reduction in loss in household income just in the first month following COVID, so following the quarantine in March. And so we've talked to other organizations serving other populations, and this frankly seems to be the trend, that vulnerable populations are hit really and particularly hard, right? Not just by the virus itself, but the secondary effects of the virus. So the impacts are definitely not equal. And particularly for a family who is already vulnerable, who is already challenged with meeting their basic needs, the Aspen Institute put out a report that showed in 1985, the typical female worker had to work for 45 weeks to generate enough income to cover expenses for a family of 4, 1 year of expenses for a family of 4. And in 2018, she needed to work more than 66 weeks to meet the same needs. So we're actually seeing families struggle more, even as the recovery tells like a different story writ large. So I appreciate hearing Laura's perspective, and I appreciate being part of this conversation to share the perspective for the most vulnerable of us and how they're experiencing some of these changes. In Philadelphia, there's been a lot of studies on a look at, federal poverty level, which hasn't moved in about 50 years. That the threshold has been set and it's been pretty fixed. But what we often don't talk about, we talk about federal poverty, we talk about area median income, but the number we don't really talk about is family self-sufficiency. Like, what does it take for a household to meet their basic needs, shelter, food, transportation? I'll also add childcare, because that is a basic and important need, and healthcare for a child school age and a non-school age child. And that's around $32 an hour, over $60,000 a year. So we talk about federal poverty, which for an individual is $12,000, or for a family of 4 is $24,000. But really what it takes to be able to sustain a family without receiving any type of federal subsidy. And we're talking about very basic livelihood. We're not even factoring student loans, frankly, and it's over $60,000 a year in the city of Philadelphia. And the average income of the families we work with, households with children, is $24,000. So again, we're talking about very vulnerable populations who struggle just to meet basic needs. So when we have a situation like COVID, unprecedented, absolutely disruptive to their lives, and they don't have the opportunity to start to build some of the wealth and assets necessary to weather this kind of storm, we're talking about a catastrophe. And so far, unfortunately, our response has been very piecemeal, very specific. Yes, eviction moratoria are great, but what happens when they end? Rent still accrues. Folks' wages are not shifting dramatically for these households. I can imagine that in the slide that Laura showed around kind of permanent job loss, most of the families that are impacted are families like the ones we serve, who are, making an income of $30,000 and less. Those jobs are not coming back. So yes, retraining, repurposing in the workforce is important, but I think we need kind of deeper, more comprehensive responses to start to get to the root problems of why these families feel stuck, can't get ahead and move out of poverty. And I'm looking forward to having that conversation in the next few minutes with this group.
Wow, Markita, thank you for sharing those numbers. I don't know if anybody else feels like I do, but I'm stunned. I mean, to think about $60,000 and think about the arguments that are going on in our government around a $15 minimum wage. And I guess that would be if both parents are working and they were making it, they could just squeak by.
Right, exactly. And I appreciate you for bringing up the 15, Natalie, because we use 15 we call that a sustainable wage, sustainable to some extent, but a family may still need SNAP or child care subsidy,
sure,
in order to sustain $15 an hour.
Sustain, but not in any way pull yourself up.
Exactly.
It's just treading water, we hope. Treading water, right?
Exactly. Surviving, not thriving.
Wow.
Definitely not thriving.
So, our next topic was resiliency, and I'd like to go back to you and just ask you about, what can we do as members of the community to help, support those families in the short term to boost their resiliency, and where would you like to see, a policy change, if you could just help us learn, a policy change that would help those families in the long term?
Yeah, so I'll say, number one, opportunities like this to talk more and hear the stories of their families. They have, these families with very low incomes often have a ton of resiliency. And oftentimes we say, oh, well, maybe we need more financial education. I will argue, and I grew up in a household with a single mother and I grew up in subsidized housing. And my mother probably could have been Secretary of the Treasury because she knew how to stretch a dollar very far, further probably than it was meant to be stretched. Families of low incomes know how to manage money. They just don't have enough income to meet all their basic needs. So it's not, so education could be a small part of it, but it's really an income deficit at the end of the day, and an opportunity deficit at the end of the day. And in this time, it's kind of surprising to me how, when we talk about resiliency, sometimes we miss that we ask people to be much more resilient than we expect institutions to be resilient. And many times we don't give people credit for the resiliency they do demonstrate in difficult circumstances like this. But what we need are policies that really demonstrate a belief in people, a belief in their own capacity. You mentioned, I think it was Rachel who mentioned empathy. I absolutely wholeheartedly believe in empathy. In fact, a radical empathy, one that seeks not to imagine how you would respond in a situation, but truly putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart to understand another person's experience from their perspective. I have to give attribution to the notion of radical empathy to Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote a beautiful book called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, which talks about some of the kind of systems of our country that lead to the inequality and equity that we see, the racial wealth gap, the gender wealth gap, and others. But changing the narrative about families who are experiencing poverty is a very important piece. And even looking at some of the short-term and the long-term solutions, many of them overlap. So first, families need access to resources. A lot of families we work with, a lot of us are dealing with children at home, right? Managing children who are at home, going to school virtually. I am doing it with teenagers, but I cannot imagine what it would be like trying to still be a woman in the workforce and managing a toddler or a newborn without access to childcare. Fortunately, I can work from home. I know many of us can. Many of the families we serve don't have their option. As Lara mentioned, they work in retail, they work in hospitality. So working from home is not an option. And even for those who do have the opportunity to work from home, some don't have paid leave, frankly. And so when they are sick or a child is sick or they just need to give attention to a child at home, paid leave is not available, the job becomes at risk. Access to the internet should be seen as a public utility because frankly, we can't live without it. So, unless you are a person with extraordinary personal wealth, you don't have to interact with systems. Access to the internet is necessary for employment, to get basic services, for basic transactions. And so that becomes really important in a time like this, when that becomes the main module for connecting with the outside world. And I think a system that trusts families and families with low incomes to be the best authors of their own lives. Right now, I'm commenting on some regulations from HUD around some of the work we're doing. And some of the biggest issues in those regulations are autonomy and documentation. Families with low incomes often are taxed and pay more for just about everything, and everything takes longer to do because they have to constantly prove that they're poor. And then they're admonished for staying poor. And then our policy creates conditions that make it almost impossible to move out of poverty, like asset limits. If you're receiving any kind of subsidy, it is hard to build savings because often you're penalized if you do. So we have to eliminate asset limits. Cliff effects, that as people start to earn more, they lose the critical components of that, of benefits that help them, that accelerate their ability to move out of poverty, so they can get to that true self-sufficiency. Be more supportive of families in that regard. So I'll happily pause there. I could go on forever. I will absolutely pause there so we can hear from the other speakers. But thank you, Natalie.
Oh, thank you, Markita. That was really helpful. And we actually had a question that came in that I'd like to address to both you and Laura. And it says, we all know how important home ownership is to individuals and the economy. So not just, as you were saying, Markita, to the individual families, but important to the economy. And, even though there's talk of a first-time homebuyer tax credit, there isn't enough affordable housing, particularly in our area. So do either of you hear about local or national legislation to address this?
Laura, if you'd like to go first.
Oh, sure. I didn't want to didn't want to jump in. Yeah. So I think we see this from several different. There are several different challenges here. We know that the millennial generation has been in particular challenged to achieve homeownership, partly because of significant student loan debt that other generations didn't have to deal with. So I think, one happily surprising feature of this pandemic has been, the incredible drop in interest rates, the massive, increase in people going out to get mortgages and buying homes. A lot of people are buying homes for the first time just because home affordability has improved somewhat. But yes, housing supply. I mean, housing it's the most interest rate sensitive sector of our economy, and to that extent, because of the nature and the fact that housing in and of itself was the focus of the prior downturn, we did see construction rates lagging significantly. And I think when you look at really long-term forecasts, you look at home construction as being one of the places where you've seen both a lot of productivity gains. We've gotten a lot better at sort of building modular homes and then putting them together at the last minute. You've seen, because of low interest rates, I think people going in and buying homes. In Philadelphia, the 10-year tax credit is an enormously politically fraught issue. I think on the one hand, you look at a lot of the homes that were built, and the 10-year tax abatement did incentivize a lot of that building. But home building occurs in many of the ways that we see other parts of our economy evolve. Construction companies build more expensive homes because they can sell them for more. They make a higher profit. And yet they're not incentivized to build. The 10-year tax abatement incentivized them to build homes, but it did not go a step further and incentivize them to build homes that are more affordable for people who are at lower incomes. So, I think it's policy, I like to say it's a broadsword. It's not a scalpel. So it often gets some things right and doesn't get other things, doesn't go far enough. So there's certainly many ways to think about policy that could help incentivize construction. But housing supply, I think it continues to be a problem. And when you look sort of ahead at the next 10 years, all the projections show that construction area is going to continue to be a place where there's going to be a lot of growth, particularly if interest rates stay very low where we expect.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly that for a lot of the families we serve who are able to save and build that nest egg and think about home ownership, they can afford, once they kind of get to a place of increased income where they can afford maximum rent and subsidized housing is actually very close, or even in some cases above a market rent. They can afford the monthly payment for a modestly priced home. It's the down payment that becomes the barrier to entry into home ownership. And on-time rent payment, there's so many studies, Urban Institute and others, that demonstrate that on-time rent payment is actually a better indicator of ability to pay a mortgage than even credit scores. So with both a good on-time rent payment history plus the ability to make monthly payments, that can be a way to help families enter into home ownership. And for many families, it's the biggest asset that they'll ever own, and the most important asset they'll ever own. So there are some policies springing up to expand down payment assistance programs, but they happen at the local level. Is again, a very piecemeal. There isn't kind of a comprehensive national approach to it. And there needs to be better coordination among programs, even at the local level, because in Philadelphia, there are probably about 6 or 7 different programs you could apply to, but they have separate criteria, separate application processes. And one of the things we've been advocating for is just more streamlined and more coordination among them to ease the barrier for families to access them and then move on to homeownership.
Thank you, Markita. That was helpful. I'd like to shift to a different topic for a moment here. EBDT, the economy, budgets, deficit, taxes. And with the last one, taxes, I think we can probably all agree that our taxes are going to go up. And it's not a political statement. I think for me, at least, it's more about the fact that we've racked up a pretty huge deficit and that our state and local governments, they've been really gutted. Their tax bases have been gutted by COVID for the reasons that Laura shared with us about, businesses closing and job loss. And so I wanted to shift to Rachel and just ask her about how she's been handling that big T question, taxes, with her clients.
Yeah, so we've had some mixed news to share with clients, right? I mean, the first being that taxes will probably increase. As you said, I don't think that's any shock to any of us. But the good news is that earlier this year, we were really able to do a lot of tax loss harvesting for our clients. So, through the volatility in March and April, we were able to sell depreciated securities, replace them with a similar investment, remain invested in the market, and really bank those tax losses. So while the volatility in March and April might not have been fun to experience, we were actually really able to get some tangible benefits out of that volatility by way of tax loss harvesting. So for our clients with significant taxable accounts, we were able to really be aggressive and take a lot of tax losses. So that's something that they can use to offset capital gains going forward. But there has been a lot of legislation affecting taxes, right? We had the Secure Act, which was passed in December of 2019, and that raised the RMD age to 72 and also put an end to the stretch IRA. And then, of course, with the CARES Act, RMDs for 2020 were waived. So that provides us a little bit of tax planning opportunity, right? So for a lot of our clients in 2020, with increasing tax rates on the horizon and not having to take RMDs for some of our retired clients, we've been looking to do a lot of Roth conversions, trying to increase income in 2020, before those increasing rates come down the pike. And also starting to look at estate planning strategies. I think one of the a lot of Biden's tax plan has to do with, reducing the estate tax exemption or eliminating that step up in cost basis upon passing. So we're really starting to have an increased look at estate tax planning, but taxes are always on our clients' radar. So we're trying to do everything we can to try and smooth rates and again, take advantage of the opportunity where possible.
Great, thank you. Laura, which angle do you want to take? There's so many ways we could go with this. We can go with, comparing now to 2008 to 2009, or, what are the scenarios that are going to lead us out of the situation? I'll leave it up to you, what direction you want to go.
For the economy going forward, or for taxes, or
taxes?
Yeah. So, I think maybe I'll just lead with the fact that the question I get asked, one of the questions I get asked the most is, do deficits even matter anymore? We've got this, really stratospheric now federal deficit, and does it matter? And, I think the answer is, you really need to break it down to the short term and the long term. And over the long term, it absolutely does matter. But the federal government is just simply in a different situation than we are as households, or even companies, or even our state and local governments, because they can really run a deficit for, for the long run, really an unlimited deficit. And it's important to realize two things. The US is in a unique position in this way because the baby boomer generation is trying to save. And really, there is no other big, safe bond market or country in the world which is issuing debt. Europe really doesn't issue a lot of debt, and it's not a highly liquid market like the US Treasury market is. So that's a long way of saying that that the U.S. really is in this unique position. We are a global reserve currency. The dollar is a global reserve currency, and there is high global demand for our debt, which enables us to really continue issuing this debt. And then finally, the Federal Reserve, as a way to offset these massive financial market losses, is also buying government debt. We're not the only country that does this. Japan does it. Europe is doing it too. It's a way to keep interest rates low, to try to stimulate our economy and help us grow. So all of those reasons, we are, I think, probably going to continue to see deficits rise. Now, one day, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, after the baby boomer wave has crested and it starts coming down again, we may very well see interest rates rise. And that may happen, for a variety of reasons. Should that happen, of course, deficits still matter. They're still going to be politically fraught. I don't think either party can claim orthodoxy now. Deficits have gone up over the last 4 years by about $6 trillion. That's more than all of the other increased deficits that we've seen in any other administration. But that said, you're probably going to see, it continues to be a hot button issue. And, Natalie, you brought it up in the last question. I think what most people don't appreciate is that cities and states cannot run unlimited deficits. They are often required to balance their budgets every year. And yet they actually spend more money. They are a bigger contributor to GDP than federal spending is. They employ way more people than the federal government does. One area that you've seen massive job cuts has been in state and local government jobs. So that's been a real problem. It's going to mean they almost immediately cut back on services. And I think you look at the last recession that ended in 2009, states and local spending stayed weak until 2013. It took them years before they were a positive contributor to growth again, because they were forced to make those budget cuts. And again, here, it's important to just, not be political about it, but to be objective and make some objective observations. It is not just Democratic states. You look at states like Wyoming, where they're heavily dependent on the oil sector and the energy sector. And because that sector has fallen so much, the state of Wyoming is looking at having to cut 30% of its services. 30%. I think it's something that is probably going to be a much larger near-term anchor around our recovery. And it's something that I think, again, we talk about things that disproportionately impact, people who are of lower income and who rely on those services. Those are really going to go away or be cut back, I should say, and really challenged. And, people in the suburbs who think, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to pay Philadelphia wage tax. Well, guess what? Your taxes are probably going to go up. Your state and local taxes are probably going to go up no matter where you are, because those systems have all just been gutted, probably way worse than they were during the last downturn. So, when people ask me, follow-up question is often, what policy would you advocate in Washington at a national level? Help the cities and states. They're really going to need it. And they contribute way more to our local economies than the federal government does.
Boy, and that's just something, Laura, you don't hear, really, in the common media world, if you will, of what they're telling us, is that it really is the state and local governments that are supporting our economy. At least I don't think we hear that. And then I think, of course, for you, Markita, this issue of state and local governments being squeezed, what impact does that have on the services for your communities?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that definitely has an impact, primarily for the nonprofits that rely on state and local government funding. So the largest organizations delivering the most services, particularly focused on health and human services are least supported by philanthropy and most supported by earned revenue associated with government contracts. So the sector is painfully exposed to even modest reductions in government funding. You know, a 5% reduction in government funding is evenly distributed across the sector, would result in like 20% of nonprofits that are currently earning a surplus to move into a deficit. Nonprofit Quarterly and others have done lots of research in this area. So I think that's the biggest hurdle. Also, nonprofits, in addition to state and local governments, and I appreciate you sharing that so much, Lara, are also big employers, you know, not just as a meds makes sense in our environment, our community in Metro Philly, but also, you know, the just large social service nonprofits are big employers. So you just you add that in first, their ability to deliver services to the most vulnerable and their role as an employer in our community. So I definitely agree with everything Lara had to say about the impact of state and local budgets on our local economy.
Thank you, Markita. You know, it's a tough topic. I know when we were preparing for this, we were talking about, geez, how do we inject some hope into this? Because it's difficult to talk about. And these are real issues. These are serious issues. And I guess I'd like to end on the concept of hope. And I know, Rachel, you shared some thoughts when we were preparing for this about how your clients are thinking about this environment in a, maybe one could say, a positive way.
Yeah. And I mean, fortunately, I think a lot of our clients have not experienced that type of job loss. You know, we were talking about resiliency, and I think financial independence definitely supports resiliency. So fortunately, our clients have, you know, had the means, had the income to support building financial independence and having the opportunity to be resilient in that sense. But I think through this time, they've really had the opportunity to step back and reprioritize and think about their relationships and what's important to them. And I'm sure, just as all of you had, you know, we've had some time to think and figure out what's important to us and focus on relationships and step back from, you know, the material things and really see if how you're living your life is serving you. So I feel like that's kind of been one semblance of hope, is that I think people are feeling much more grateful and much more gratitude for what they have, and really stepping back and seeing what's important. So I think that's starting to drive some more of our conversations around how they can make an impact or change their lives for the better.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. And Markita, you know, when we were talking about this, you said, you know, if there's a silver lining to this impact from COVID, it's perhaps the focus on the inequities that we have in our society. Did you want to add anything from that perspective?
Absolutely. So many folks are stepping up to first see them. We need a common language. We need to agree that there are inequities that are structural, that are systemic, not based on individual action. That's number one. So we need to just be on the same page and get some common definitions and work from them together. I also think that this moment is causing a lot of folks in different sectors to accelerate innovation, to be much more creative in their approaches. Our work, we're trying to find ways to integrate technology to serve more people and to scale. So we're actually speeding up. We're not slowing down. We're not wasting this crisis. And then, frankly, my hope is that empathy becomes more infectious than this virus, that it spreads and that people are able to see one another, listen to one another, truly do the work to understand perspectives and where we come from and the challenges and the hurdles we're facing. I don't want to have the biggest house on the block. I don't want it to be doing well when my neighbors are not. That makes me vulnerable. That makes any of us vulnerable. I want other people to be doing well and to persist and to move from surviving to thriving. That makes us all do better. So I say let's ensure that everyone's doing well, particularly the most vulnerable of us, because that protects all of our interests when we do so.
That's great. I think that's a great way to wrap up the hope section. So thank you for that, Markita. I guess I'd like to go now, if you don't mind, and then we're just a few minutes away from our networking, where I know that Colleen's going to break us out and our panelists will be in different rooms. I know that there are people that want to speak to you and ask you questions. So thank you for sticking around for that. So just quickly, a lightning round at the end on what hope looks like for 2021. And who wants to go first? Laura, go ahead. You
Sure, I'll shoot out there that, I think, it's hard to follow Markita, but I think that's exactly right. I think what she said, for all of us, I think this concept of resiliency, I think, looking at the economic data, given the massive dislocation that we've seen in employment and output in the economy, consumer confidence has stayed really, really high. So I think it just shows that across our country, people are really looking beyond this already, and they're already gearing up for when they can get back to work. I think Americans really are workers, and that always gives me hope at the end of the day. Good productivity, creative solutions, and workers.
That's great. Thanks, Laura. Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind really is like hope is really humanity, right? I think Markita really touched on it nicely, and shared empathy, understanding, and I think we're seeing a lot of that, and it's really it gives me hope, certainly. So
Great, thank you, Rachel. Markita, some final words. Hope for 2021.
Just more of what Laura and Rachel mentioned, empathy and innovation and creativity.
That's great. Thank you. Well, Laura, Rachel, Markita, I cannot thank you enough. This has been a fantastic panel. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure all of our participants did too. At this point, Colleen is going to put us into breakout rooms for 15 minutes of networking. So Colleen, go ahead.
Okay, just give me 1 minute. I'm going to just move a few folks around. Hang on.
And just while we're waiting for that, for those that drop off, thank you all so much for joining, and hopefully we see you all at our December event for the holidays. So hopefully you stick around, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining.